Thank you. So I'm aware that I am the last thing standing between you and lunch, so I will bear that in mind. So I've been asked to talk about a more kind of policy perspective on this, what we've all been through together. And this is very much a personal view. I'm very aware that there are lots of people in this room who have had perspectives on this from different places. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that where you sit can change your perspective quite a lot. So I am part of the University of Warwick, and I'm also part of the So I made some little pictures because I like little pictures. So this is sort of how I think about this sort of path from policy, from science into policy. And I guess this is one sort of path which is going through SAGE. There will be others, other paths are available. I think Ian had a very nice picture of this earlier. So I've just picked some of the subgroups of SAGE. So in the brackets are the number of participants of SAGE as listed on the government website. So you can see that 151 people have participated at one point or another in a SAGE meeting. Now, if you go and look at the actual minutes, you'll find that the number of people in each SAGE meeting is a lot smaller than that. So some of these will be people who've just been to 1 or 2 meetings, some of them will be people who've been to lots, but I think it gives you an idea of the kind of scale of things. And then there are subgroups of SAGE, so environmental modelling group, SPI-M, which you've heard lots about already, SPI-B, which is the behavioural subgroup. And there are lots of other things hanging around like nerve tag, and there was quite a nice discussion yesterday about the kind of the more cross-cutting task and finish groups. So there was one for kids, which we called Spy Kids, because you've also take your kicks where you can find them. So I highlighted that's me. I was sitting within SPI-M. And SPI-M provided lots of different things. So rapid responses to commissions, sometimes extremely rapid. So I think until May 2020, when the timing of the meeting moved from Mondays to Wednesdays. So before that, we would get asked the question on a Friday evening. So you get an email, maybe 6 p.m, maybe 10 p.m. on a Friday evening. Please email in your insights by Monday morning in time for SPI-M to meet at, I don't know if it was still 10 a.m. at that point, but very early. And they moved it back by 2 days. So the idea was that we wouldn't have to work the weekend. Of course, what actually happened was we got 2 extra days. It was great. And I think one of the big strengths of SPI-M, and some people have talked about this already, has been having these multiple independent groups all working on similar questions. So you're all getting the same commissions, you're all getting asked the same question, and you come back in maybe 2 days' time, maybe 4 days' time, and you present what you have found out in the meantime. And you have what I would consider to be essentially a really rapid peer review. I found this, I thought it's been a really interesting process, just being able to kind of hear what everybody else was thinking about the same kind of questions, and having a really frank discussion about the pros and cons about the things that people have done. And then I think one of the strengths of SPI-M has been production of these things we call consensus statements, and I have been very grateful that we have a marvelous secretariat in SPI-M who essentially write these things. I have no idea what we would have done without the secretariat. making and then I guess SPI-M also provides a route for everything else. So I feel like, particularly in the press, people kind of get this idea that the government asks us questions and we give answers. And to some extent that's true, but SPI-M has always been very open to people sending in other things. So, for example, during as Omicron was flaring up, there was a big discussion on Twitter between Graham Medley and somebody else about, you know, were we just doing the things that the government asked us to do? And I sort of wanted to put it, I didn't get involved, but I sort of wanted to reply and say, well, the commission said, please send us anything you have about Omicron. So it was not really very specific. And I think SPI-M has always been very open to the idea of sending in other things that we think are interesting, useful, important. And some of those things will get taken up and go somewhere, and some of them won't. So yes, supported by the Secretariat. And I think have really provided also a kind of link between the policy and the science. So they did lots of really great work explaining what we had done, and also making sure that the questions we were being asked were things that could be sensibly approached by modelling. And I think that has been invaluable. We've heard a lot about data provision, and I'm afraid I will talk more about it. I think it's really important. So data has come through what was PHE and is now UKHSA, and I think there have been specific people within these groups who have been really invaluable to making sure that we get the data and we get it in a reasonable time frame. And DSTL sort of set up all the pipeline for getting that. But it has been a massive team effort. So somehow you look at this core of SAGE and subgroups, which is already quite a large group of people. But behind each one of those people, there is, you know, there are people in our institutions where it has quite a large group of people. So when we're getting commissions, you know, we're coming back and we're asking people, what can we do? And then behind those groups, there are the wider institution and the wider scientific community. And I think RAMP has been a really important part of that. Particularly, I think right at the beginning, we had lots of people coming and offering help, and that was very much appreciated, but also really hard to deal with, because when you have 2 days at the weekend to provide your response, trying to organize some other people to effectively use their skills was pretty difficult. And I think RAMP provided a really important service to doing that. And I think one of the things I'd like to think about going forwards is maybe this idea of kind of different timescales. So people who were sort of on SPI-M were thinking on these very short term, you know, 2 days, 4 days, if you have a week, you're doing pretty well. And that was really important, but also it was very important to have people standing a bit further back, thinking a bit more long term, you know, thinking about what the next thing is that's going to be important, thinking about how to build these models in a robust way. And I think RAMP was very important too. So there are lots of routes into policy, and I probably have not seen all of them, but the kind of obvious one is through the chairs of SAGE. I think the Secretariat have been an incredibly important route into policy as well. But also all of these meetings have observers. So each meeting will have people from UKHSA. There are also participants of SPI-M who are part of UKHSA. But there'll be observers from Cabinet Office, from Treasury, from Number 10, from the devolved administrations, all watching the discussion and understanding the kind of wider discussion, not just the papers that are written and put forward. So I sort of added that on the top, and I coloured myself in again because I had a part-time secondment to the Cabinet Office COVID task force. And that was a really interesting experience. So it came quite late in the day. I started in January 2022. I can't do years anymore, it's too hard. But it was a really interesting to get a different perspective on this kind of route. And I think just the communication between levels is quite difficult. It's very hard to get an overall view of things sitting from somewhere in the middle. So there's a question about when science becomes policy. And I think SAGE tries to take quite a hard line on that. We advise, we do science, we do not do policy, and that's important, and it's important to have that distinction. But I think it's also important to realise that by talking to policymakers, there is a bit of a blurring of a line here. So the questions that we're being asked in changes the modelling that we're doing, the questions that we can answer changes the questions that get asked, and that changes the policy. So I think there is a bit of a blurred line there. But all the same, we only ever want to be answering the question, what would happen if? Give me information about, and not tell me why we should do this thing that I want to do. So I think that is a very definite distinction that is required. So I'm going back to my list, which I realized I changed on this slide and I didn't change earlier on, so it's slightly different. And thinking about the different things that SPI-M was doing. So we have these kind of very rapid responses to commissions. We have these consensus statements. I'm going to put some actual pictures in here. So the R values, I guess, is something that got started fairly early on, became a thing that we had to keep doing. And this is a fairly early version of it. It eventually got taken within UKHSA. So I guess a lot of you probably know about how this was working, but you have all the different groups, all the different lines are different groups, sometimes more than one model from the same group. And then you have the combination of all the estimates, which is the grey line at the side. You can see the previous weeks. Maybe I'll talk about the medium-term projections at the same time. So these also came probably slightly later than the R value. So this is answering the question, okay, well, that was what the R value is. What does that mean? So what does that mean going forwards? And I think these were very kind of short-term projections, but it's made in a similar kind of way. So everybody submits their projection. You can see the end of the single lines, can't really, in the background, which are individual models, and then you have a consensus view. And I think some of those were surprisingly useful, perhaps, for operational purposes. So the hospitals really would quite like to know, well, next week, how many people are going to turn up? And that's not a very difficult question for us to answer because we know the cases that happened. So going very short term, we can provide a reasonable estimate of that. So this is just projecting forwards. This is not making any kind of changes to how people are behaving or policy. This is just saying, well, okay, we are here, we're moving in this direction. I feel like I was going to say something else, but now I can't remember. Okay, never mind. So I don't know to what extent people really saw these. I mean, I've taken them off the government website, so they are public. So these are 8-week scenarios. I don't know if they're always 8 weeks. They sort of came out of a question of what's going to happen. So here, the dots are the data. The line is, I think, yeah. So then the coloured lines are different projections, assuming an R value going forwards. So on the 4th of the 5th, I guess, on that particular date, we make a change, people's behavior changes in some way to change the R value at that date, what will happen? So you see you get a lag because hospitalizations take a little while to happen, and then you get a sort of fan of different outcomes, which are the different values of R that we're assuming. And the idea was to essentially try and make sure that what happened was something in this fan. So these are a different range of things that might happen. You can see that in the third one along, we sort of missed. And that's partly because things changed before we made the change. So you can see that it's a bit early. Should have done these in a different order. These were sort of, I think, partly a reaction to something that went not great with the reasonable worst case scenario. So I think the reasonable worst case scenario is a really difficult thing to talk about to the general public, so much so that I was a little bit nervous of putting this on and thought maybe I shouldn't. So the reasonable worst case scenario is a thing for people to plan to. So it says, okay, if we plan to the reasonable worst case scenario, we should be okay. It's not that we think this is going to happen, it's that this is the worst thing that we might reasonably expect to happen. That's a very difficult thing to produce as a modeler. It's a very difficult thing to produce in an epidemiological system because the timing is extremely flexible, right? So you might say, okay, well, we think at some point maybe something will go wrong, we'll get a new variant, we'll get a wave. And we might make a suggestion for how big that wave might be, but when it might happen is really very difficult to know. So this particular one is one that went quite wrong in the sense that this was not a finished reasonable worst case scenario. It was the first step in a conversation and it got leaked. And so this is in the Financial Times. You can see that it got leaked to the general public and it wasn't even finished. And I think it sort of harmed the communication a lot. And I think it's a very difficult thing to know how to still produce these things which people need, but without having that kind of harm to public understanding. So it was quite disturbing to see these things just kind of in the paper, because it's a very difficult thing to kind of really understand what it's for. Okay, so I should have said at the beginning, there's no maths in this talk. So I'm only really thinking about this process. And I think there are some inherent tensions in the process. And there are some things that we can try and think about and try and do better. And I think there are things that did get better over time. But there are inherent difficulties. So I said I would talk about data. And I think data is a very difficult thing to solve in this kind of situation. We did lots of things in a kind of emergency situation quite quickly that we maybe would have found more difficult to do in a non-emergency situation. But there are those inherent privacy concerns. Once data is out, it is out. There's no putting it back. So those are difficult things. Okay. I talked a little bit about this kind of, no, I didn't. So I think the second one down is thinking about the difference between making people aware as soon as we know what's going on, telling people what's going on, and so that they can make informed decisions. So this is not really thinking about policy, about the government, but about the general public. So, you see Omicron coming, at what stage should you tell the general public something is coming? And I think there is a kind of playoff there between the earlier you can tell people, the more they know what's going to happen, the more, you don't want to be hiding things from people. But also, if you tell people things early, it is uncertain, things will change. It's harder to be kind of really clear about what's going on, and the accuracy of that statement may be different. So I'm going to think a little bit about the last two. I talked a bit about these sort of really short deadlines, and I think that was very challenging to work in, because we were very aware that what we were doing might not be used by anybody, but also might be used to make really important decisions. And trying to get things on these kind of really short deadlines is somewhat at odds with doing careful, robust science, which is what we would all like to do, but it's sort of necessary. If you don't give advice when the decision is being made, doing nothing is still a decision. So are there some mitigations we could take against that? Well, I think these multiple groups was really important, and that works better when everybody is receiving the same data, so that we can have a conversation where everybody is aware of the same things. I think that was something that got sorted in SPI-M over time, fairly early on, and really made those discussions much more productive. In order to do that, setting up those data pipelines in advance would be really helpful. And it needs the existence of these multiple groups. So I think it's really important to keep funding different independent groups. I think that was something that Juniper did very well, that we have kind of groups in different places but working together. But funding, Juniper and the London School and Imperial and other groups is really important. And having multiple people within each group, if you are a group of 1 or 2 people, it's very difficult to do robust, quick science over an extended period of time. You really kind of need to be able to talk to each other and also to kind of tag in and out. I think another mitigation of these kind of careful science problems is to really try and communicate our uncertainty as well as possible. So particularly when thinking about Omicron again, right at the beginning, things were just very uncertain, and that meant that things changed a lot. And it's not that we could necessarily have done better, it's just that things were uncertain and took time. I at some point would like to think about trying to communicate structural uncertainty as well as kind of parameter uncertainty. I think we do really well at communicating when we're fitting our model. We have that kind of parameter uncertainty, and we do really well at that. But there is an underlying uncertainty, which is essentially what modeling we're using. And when we're putting together all these different models in medium-term projections, for example, when different models drop in and out, that means that that kind of uncertainty quantification is changing over time. So we're quantifying a little bit by including multiple models, and I think that's really important. But if your only statistical model drops out for a week because something didn't run, sort of like to have more uncertainty rather than less uncertainty. So I think that's something to think about. I suspect there may be lessons to learn from other areas. And then going back to open science, so I think this is very much a balance between, as scientists, we really just want to talk to everybody, and I want to be able to go back to my colleagues and talk about the things I'm doing, and I want to know what's happening at the different levels of the process. I'd like to know what's happening at different sideways of the process. I feel like sitting in SPI-M, I didn't always know a lot about what was happening in SPI-B or in EMG. But all of these things are slightly in tension with politics. So the government would like to ask us questions about what policies they might be implementing, but also they don't really want everybody to know what policies they might be implementing and what things they're thinking about. And that is frustrating to a scientist, but it is a reality, and I think it's something we have to think about. And you can end up with these situations where things get leaked, and that makes what we're doing worse. And we would really like to be able to have a conversation with the person that is going to use the product about what it is that they want from it, what sorts of things they're thinking about doing, thinking about this reasonable case, worst case scenario. We were trying to work out, okay, like, we're probably not going to end up on this sort of blue line going up to 4,000. I don't know what this is, even deaths a day, because we would do something about it. But then you want to ask somebody, okay, well, what would you do? So that was the kind of conversation we were trying to have, and I think it's a difficult one when things get leaked. Good. So I think maybe just one way of proceeding in this sort of direction is to think about trying how to show policymakers that having more communication at different levels is useful and makes things better. And I think that is something that got better over time. We started getting much more information from higher up about what it was that was being used and what was useful. So I did say that it was a team effort, and it is, and I still have less people off this slide. I'm sure one big group of people would be the SPI-M Secretariat, and I would like to thank them too, but in particular, I guess, the Warwick group on the left and the Juniper group on the right. And if you're interested in Warwick or Juniper, there are 2 URLs.
Thank you very much, Louise.